Susan, baby formula is so expensive, it's nearly bleeding me dry. I was venting to my best friend Susan over text when, by accident, she forwarded my message to my ex-boyfriend. Late that night, a flood of bank transfer notifications began to flood my phone, 100,000, 500,000, a million. Finally, Dennis sent a message, "I've given everything I have to you and your daughter. Will you come back?" When news of Dennis's engagement finally reached my ears, a hollow, quiet emptiness spread through me. It was earth-shattering news everyone else seemed to have known for ages, while I'd been kept in the dark until the last possible moment. Just last night, he'd returned home from a social event, slightly tipsy, around 2 in the morning. Yet, as always, he pushed open my door. I awoke to him beside me, startled. His tall, lean frame collapsed onto my small bed, almost overwhelming its fragile frame. Drenched in cold night air and the sharp scent of alcohol, he pulled me close, burying his face in my hair. "I've told you countless times, get a bigger bed." I lay obediently in his embrace. "No need to spend the money. This bed's enough." "Enough?" Dennis brushed a strand of hair off my forehead, chuckling. "Did you forget the time you almost fell off?" A hot flush spread across my cheeks. Dennis, outwardly, was always the picture of cold composure, strikingly handsome, serious, and distant. He even wore a sandalwood bead bracelet year-round. His secretary and assistants were all men, and he maintained a reserved distance from women, whether in public or private. Many of the city's socialites gossiped about him in private, saying they couldn't even imagine him with a woman. Some suggested that Dennis probably kept that same icy demeanor in romantic settings. Do you think Dennis has ever kissed a woman? Can't imagine what it's like dating him. I bet he's not into women at all. He just seems so impossible. Anna, you've known Dennis since you were kids, have you ever seen him on a date? I would only smile and shake my head. No one knew the truth. In countless late nights, Dennis had quietly opened the door to my room. In my humble maid's quarters, I transformed from girl to woman, my innocence painted and crumpled to his liking. Last night, he stayed in my room until 6 in the morning. I urged him to leave several times before he finally rose, a trace of reluctance in his eyes. He was the son of the powerful Morgan family, while my mother had merely been a maid in their household. Our difference in status made it impossible for me to harbor any real hopes. Dennis was destined to marry a woman of equal social standing. To him, I was nothing more than dust. But I never expected the day to come so quickly. Still, perhaps it was for the best. It was time for everything to end. So, when Tom, a college friend who'd pursued me for half a year, asked me out for dinner, I agreed for the first time. Tom looked pleasantly surprised. After dinner, he walked me back to my rented place and confessed his feelings once again. I looked at him, a world apart from Dennis. He was gentle, kind, and clean-cut, with a warm, harmless demeanor. Back in college, we'd both been in the painting club, sharing similar interests and hobbies. I didn't dislike him. In fact, I thought I might even be able to grow to like him in a normal, ordinary way. I could live like any other girl, date, and build a typical life. This time, I didn't turn him down. Can I think about it? Of course, Anna. I'll wait for you patiently. That night, I didn't return to Dennis's home. After a bath, my phone suddenly rang. I hesitated, staring at his name flashing on the screen, before finally answering. Come downstairs. Dennis. I'll only wait 5 minutes. His voice was low, tinged with displeasure, and he hung up before I could respond. I'd feared him since childhood, so I hurriedly dressed and rushed downstairs. His car was parked under the shadow of a tree. I climbed in, heart pounding with trepidation. Dennis sat back in his seat, the strong smell of alcohol enveloping him. He ignored me, and I dared not say a word. We drove to a secluded spot by the river, where the driver parked and got out for a smoke. I could practically hear my heart pounding like a drum. Do you need something? Anna, it seems you've become quite bold lately. Dennis opened his eyes slowly, flicking the ash from his cigarette with a careless gesture. My heart jolted, and in that instant, I remembered the events from earlier that day. A cold chill seeped down my spine. Come here. He pointed to his lap. His gaze was icy, scanning my face inch by inch, cutting like a blade. My legs shook so badly they nearly cramped. I crawled onto his lap, still too afraid to look at him directly. Did you forget everything I taught you? I didn't. Trembling, I lifted my gaze and dared to place a kiss on his chin. He chuckled, a low sound, as his hand, still holding the cigarette, cupped my chin. Is this how I taught you to kiss a man? His fingers tightened, causing a faint ache in my jaw, and I couldn't help but let out a soft plea. Dennis, it hurts. Anna, he murmured. If you don't make me happy tonight, this will be far from over. All my experience came from his preferences. So, naturally, I knew exactly how to satisfy him. The car was spacious enough, yet several times, I still hit my head. Eyes brimming with tears, I pleaded, Dennis, can we go back, please? Useless. Dennis stroked the top of my head, gently massaging the spot I'd hurt. Dennis. What do you call me? Master. Anna. He looked down at me, his frosty gaze laced with a hint of anger. Dennis. I murmured his name softly, incoherently. He seemed satisfied, his kisses finally softening. By the time we returned to the old Morgan estate, it was already deep into the night. He went directly to my room. Just as I was about to take a shower, my phone rang. It was Tom calling, and my heart froze as I glanced nervously at Dennis. He smirked at me, answer it. As I took the call, Dennis pulled me into his arms. Maybe he knew me better than I knew myself, because in his presence, I quickly crumbled. Tom noticed something off in my voice, his tone cautious. Anna, is everything okay? I was helpless against Dennis, and, in a panic, I hung up the phone. Anna. Dennis tightened his grip on my wrist, forcing me to look at him. I know I was wrong. I won't do it again. Won't do it again? Do you like him? No, I don't like him. I don't, really. Fear crept in. I knew that if he got angry, I'd be the one to suffer. Instinctively, I tried to placate him, hoping he'd let me go. But suddenly, I remembered, he was getting married. You're getting married soon. Let me go, please? I'll leave, go to another city. Or even another country, just let me go. I wrapped my arms around him, my voice trembling as I begged. I hoped he'd take into account our long history together, the faint bond between us, and finally set me free. Dennis pushed me away. He stood up, methodically buttoning his shirt, then tossed his tie to me. Tie it for me. I straightened up, kneeling at the edge of the bed, tying his tie with the same meticulous care as countless times before. Just as I was about to release it, he leaned in close, laughing softly near my ear. Good girl. I already spoke with Lily. What? I don't like her. Once we're married, she'll just be there for show, filling a role. Dennis pinched my cheek. So, why are you jealous? I'm not. He took out a cigarette, lighting it slowly. When the time comes, you'll go along with her and marry in. Won't you? Do you really think I'd neglect you? I felt as if lightning had struck, leaving me numb. What do you mean? I'll go along and marry in? Dennis began walking away, his tone light and casual as he said, Lily agreed to bring you as her personal maid. You'll come with her to the Morgan estate. I stood there, face pale, in this humble little room, watching his tall, unyielding figure recede. All the years of hidden affection, the love I'd never dared express, suddenly felt like the cruelest joke. Relax, I'm not abandoning you. Look at you, so pitiful. Dennis turned back to me, a hint of pity in his gaze. He came over, held me, and kissed me softly. Be good. In this life, I'll cherish only you. Isn't it laughable? You'll actually be a bridal maid as part of the dowry. Lily smiled at me with a mocking glint in her eyes. But, Anna, you must have some charm. Even with his marriage, Dennis can't let you go, can he? I sat there, dazed, unable to force even a hint of a polite smile. I hear you're quite good at painting. Lily stood up, approaching me, and lifted my hand. Dennis had always admired my hands, so even though I was only the daughter of a maid, I'd never had to do any hard labor in the Morgan household. To be fair, the Morgan family treated me well. And Dennis had been good to me too. Years ago, my mother had been kicked out by her harsh mother-in-law. Alone, she braved the elements with me, barely 2 years old, enduring countless hardships. It was Dennis's mother who took pity on her, giving her a place to stay and a roof over our heads. This allowed me to grow up with food, clothing, and the chance to go to college. My mother's health had been poor, and she passed away early. But even in her last moments, she urged me to remember the Morgan family's kindness, never to forget our debt to them. I had always complied with Dennis's wishes, never refusing him. Because I knew that my life and my mother's both belonged to the Morgan family. And also, because, when my heart first began to feel, I secretly fell in love with him. Such beautiful hands, Lily remarked. But her gaze turned haughty as she looked down at me. What a shame they belong to someone as lowly as you. Because of someone like you, Dennis has really displeased my parents. She smirked, eyeing me with contempt. You know Dennis has an older brother, right? Even if he's illegitimate, he's his father's favorite. Anna, my family, and I can help Dennis reclaim what's rightfully his. But if I'm unhappy, Miss Miller, rest assured. I forced myself to stand despite the waves of discomfort I'd felt since morning. I had nearly thrown up at breakfast, and a bad feeling had settled over me. Dennis had never been particularly careful about contraception. He'd always say, "What's the big deal? If we have a child, we'll keep it. Do you think I can't afford to take care of you and the kid?" The thought made me look down, chuckling to myself. What's so funny? Lily asked. Irritated. Nothing, Miss Miller. I won't be a bother to you, don't worry, I assured her. I went to the hospital first, and by the time I returned to the Morgan estate, Dennis wasn't back yet. So, I sat on the stone steps by the entrance, waiting for him. When his car finally pulled up, I got up and ran towards him, thrilled. In childhood, I often waited like this for him to come home from school. But as I grew older, I came to understand the gap between us and stopped doing it. He seemed surprised, but spread his arms and caught me as I leaped into them. I hugged him tightly, rising onto my toes to kiss him. Dennis, I've been waiting for you for so long. Maybe my rare show of affection lightened his mood. He responded, kissing me back and asking softly, "What's got you acting all sweet today? Don't you like it when I'm like this?" Dennis held my face, his thumb brushing the corner of my lips. He chuckled, pulling me closer. What do you think? I could feel the heat in his gaze. My face burned, but I clung to his neck, unwilling to let go. He carried me into the main house. Instead of taking me to my room, he led me upstairs, to his bedroom. Your bed is too small, he said, pressing me against the door for a deep kiss as he opened it. I've told you before. There's just no space. Moonlight quietly flooded the room, casting a soft glow. He held me, habitually reaching for a cigarette. But I boldly took his cigarette case and lighter from him. Dennis, I just want you to hold me. Perhaps because he was still in a good mood, he indulged me, setting aside his craving and wrapping his arms around me. What's gotten into you tonight? Being so clingy. Dennis kissed my damp temple, not even realizing the tenderness in his voice. Hug me a little tighter, will you? I nestled closer into his embrace, feeling my still flat stomach pressed against the warmth of his body. Right now, the little bean-sized life inside me, could she feel that her father was holding her too? I held back my tears, hiding my face in his chest, pretending to cling to him. If you'd been this sweet all along, is there anything I wouldn't have given you? Then, will you send me abroad to study? Maybe because I'd asked to leave so many times, his patience thinned, and his voice held a hint of anger. Fine, you want to go? Give me a child first. He grasped my chin, his eyes sharp as blades. Anna, unless you give me a daughter who looks just like you, don't even think about leaving me. With those words, the last small glimmer of hope in me was finally snuffed out. I forced myself to stay calm, using all my charm to soothe him. It took a while, but Dennis eventually cooled down, pulling me back into his arms. You'll stay right here, and when the wedding day comes, I'll make sure you're well taken care of. Once his temper had completely settled, I got up from the bed to fetch him some water. I added a small amount of sleeping powder to his glass. He drank it without a clue, soon drifting into a deep sleep. I stood beside the bed, watching him sleep with a kind of longing. I remembered when I was only 6, tagging along behind him like a little shadow. He'd get a bit annoyed, but every time I pouted in disappointment, he'd relent. Back then, I was young and naive. We'd played pretend, and I was his little bride in those games. I'd naturally assumed that one day, when I grew up, I'd marry him for real. How foolish, Anna. You're only a maid's daughter. I knelt beside him, holding his hand and gently pressing it against my stomach. Dennis, I'm leaving. Everything I said was sincere. I hope you find happiness in your new marriage and that it lasts forever. My mother's hometown was in a far, distant village. In her youth, she had eloped for love, leaving behind my grandmother. In the end, she died in a foreign land, never able to return to her roots. During her last moments, she clutched my hand, calling out for her mother over and over again. I knew she regretted it, she wanted to go home. So I brought her ashes, and my baby, back to her hometown. Grandmother, despite her old age, insisted on taking care of us. When I arrived, I changed all my contact information. I even discarded my phone. This place was thousands of kilometers away from the city where the Morgan family resided. As long as I didn't look back, no news would reach me here. When I was 3 months pregnant, my belly had already started to show a slight curve. One afternoon, I was sitting under the eaves, soaking up the sun. Grandmother, wearing her reading glasses, was sewing a small cotton jacket for the baby. Suddenly, the gate creaked open. Half asleep, I saw Dennis's assistant, Ian, and thought I was still dreaming. He was Dennis's most trusted assistant, his most capable subordinate. How could he possibly appear in this remote village so far away? Miss Anna. The moment Ian saw me, he visibly relaxed, letting out a long breath. Ian, why are you here? I slowly sat up, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. Ian looked exhausted, his eyes red and weary. After I spoke, he even took off his glasses to wipe away a tear. Miss Anna, could you go see Mr. Dennis? Or at least give him a call? Instinctively, I bit my lip, pulling a thin blanket over my belly. I'm sorry. By now, Dennis should have already married Lily. I averted my gaze. Ian, go back. Miss Anna. He started to say more, but I lay back down and closed my eyes. Ian stood there for a long moment before he finally spoke softly. Mr. Dennis didn't hold a wedding. Nor did he marry Miss Miller. I was surprised. But I still said nothing. Dennis was a man of ability, strategy, and ambition. He wouldn't be controlled by any woman. Even without an alliance, his illegitimate older brother couldn't outmaneuver him. There had always been so many women vying for his attention. If he suddenly decided to marry Lily, it was only because she meant something different to him. As for why the marriage hadn't happened, what did it have to do with me? Ian, clearly disappointed, said nothing further and turned to leave. When night fell, the sound of a knock echoed through the courtyard gate. I assumed it was Ian again and asked grandmother to turn him away. But then, the gate was forcefully pushed open, nearly causing grandmother to fall. I hurried over. only to see several unfamiliar faces. "Miss Anna, if you don't want to scare your grandmother, you'd best come with us. Don't worry, we won't make things difficult for you." I looked at my elderly, frightened grandmother and knew I had no other choice. "Let me grab a coat, please wait a moment." I steadied myself, speaking as calmly as I could. The car drove for almost the entire night. Just before dawn, it stopped in front of a solitary villa. I pulled my coat tightly around me as I walked inside, and there, standing in the living room, was a man. "Anna, don't you recognize me?" The man slowly turned around, and in that moment, my breath froze. He was Marco, the illegitimate son of the Morgan family, and Dennis's father was particularly fond of him. But because of Dennis's mother's opposition, Marco had never been able to enter the Morgan family officially. Did you need something from me?" I was just curious. "You know the old tale of valuing the box and discarding the pearl? Well, there's a similar story going around now. Have you heard of it?" I shook my head. Marco motioned for me to sit down. Dennis's marriage to Lily was suddenly called off. "Do you know why?" I shook my head again. Marco smiled pleasantly. But it made my skin crawl. "They say Dennis called off the engagement at the last minute because Lily was missing a crucial part of her dowry." I froze, my fingers instinctively clenching. Marco chuckled casually. Since the wedding was cancelled so abruptly, the Miller family was furious. Lily's father was livid, and for the first time, Dennis was punished by his family. I heard that. He paused deliberately, looking at me, speaking slowly. "I heard his entire back was whipped to shreds, and he's still lying in bed, unable to move." It felt as if a heavy weight had crashed down on my chest, leaving a dull ache. The facade I'd struggled to maintain was cracked open. I bit down hard, nails digging into my palms, willing myself not to cry. But my tears betrayed me, spilling over anyway. "A few days ago, when he was unconscious, Dennis called out your name several times right in front of his father. Father was furious, so much so that he fell ill, and even Dennis's mother was affected. After all, it was she who had insisted on keeping you in the Morgan household." Marco stood slowly. "Anna, I've often wondered these past days between power and love, which would Dennis choose? In truth, I've never thought of myself as a pitiful person. Even though my father abandoned me because I was a girl, I still had the best mother in the world. Later, I met Dennis's kind mother, and, of course, Dennis. When I was young, I always followed Dennis around. He was 3 years older than me. Most boys that age wouldn't want to play with a little girl, but he never pushed me away. As I grew older, I became aware of the uncomfortable gap between us and began to distance myself from him. Yet, he continued to treat me kindly, giving me gifts on every holiday. In middle school, when I was harassed by some thugs outside school, Dennis found out and fought them off, getting himself bruised and bloody. I hugged him, crying my heart out, but he still had the mind to tease me, saying, "My Anna has grown up. She's not close to me anymore." It wasn't that I didn't want to be close to him, it was that I'd come to realize the insurmountable divide between us. No one in the Morgan family treated me as just a maid. In fact, staying in the servants' quarters was my own choice, because my mother had lived there before me. While she was alive, she constantly reminded me never to forget my place, never to forget the Morgan family's kindness, and not to take advantage of their kindness by overstepping my bounds. I held on to her words since childhood. So, whatever Dennis asked of me, I complied. Even when we grew up and he told me, "Anna, be with me. I'll cherish you forever, I swear it on my life." Deep down, I was afraid, anxious, knowing I wasn't worthy of such promises from him. But I never turned him down. Even though he never offered me any formal commitment. I still remember that night. The moonlight was just as beautiful as it was on the night I left. He kissed away my tears over and over again. In the end, maybe he grew frustrated with my crying, because he pressed his lips against mine, silencing me until I could barely breathe, let alone cry. Baby girl, why are you crying? We're finally together, aren't you happy? He might have just said it to comfort me, but at that moment, it truly calmed me. After all, we'd grown up together, and being young and naive, I thought maybe we were the exception. Maybe Dennis really would marry me. Maybe the Morgan family wouldn't turn me away. Alright, enough worrying. He pulled me into his arms, gently smoothing back my hair, kissing my tear-streaked cheeks. Anna is such a crybaby. Dennis, do you like me? You silly girl. Can't you tell? That long night was beautiful, like the dawn would never come. In that moment, I was truly happy. If we could stay forever young and thoughtless, maybe we would never feel so much pain. The Morgan family elders began arranging marriage prospects for him. Madame Gu even showed me several photos, asking which woman I thought would suit Dennis. It felt as if a knife had been lodged in my chest, twisting with every heartbeat, causing fresh pain. Even though Dennis dismissed them all, showing no interest, I gradually understood that it was only a matter of time before he got married. Perhaps he did feel a sliver of affection for me. After all, we had grown up together, and our bond was a bit closer than his with others. But I knew my place. I never hoped to use that tiny bit of affection to gain anything. The memories faded, and I returned to the present. Marco had me tied to a wooden frame. His voice remained soft, almost gentle. Don't worry, Anna. I made sure they tied you lightly, you won't feel much pain. What do you intend to do? I pulled in my stomach, trying to hide any sign of my pregnancy. Dennis won't come to save me. You don't need to go through all this trouble. And how do you know that? Marco even took a tissue to wipe the cold sweat from my forehead. Anyone could see that I'm not important to Dennis. But do you know why Dennis suddenly decided to marry Lily? I froze. Marco let out a bitter laugh. It's because father wanted to allow me into the Morgan family, which angered Dennis. He knew I wanted to marry Lily, so he stepped in and ruined the engagement. The Miller family, of course, preferred their daughter marry Dennis rather than a bastard like me, so they readily agreed. As compensation for taking my marriage, he graciously allowed father to invite me to the wedding as Marco, but nothing more. If you hadn't left, the wedding would have happened as planned. But during that wedding, can you guess what would have happened? Marco's smile turned sinister. For all these years, has Dennis's world been truly airtight? Could everything he does really go unnoticed? I started trembling, glimpsing fragments of a truth I dared not believe. Anna, don't blame me for being ruthless. I may be an illegitimate son, but I don't deserve to die. Dennis has left me no choice. But the wedding didn't happen. He's still injured, unable to leave his bed. How has Dennis cornered you? Do you know what he planned to do on his wedding day? On his wedding night, he wanted his new bride to rekindle old feelings with the man who almost became her husband under the influence of alcohol or something else. Then, the groom would catch them in the act, shaming me forever, leaving me unable to compete with him. The Miller family would be forced to compensate Dennis, and he could discard Lily without issue and marry you. That's impossible, Marco. That's just your speculation. Then why do you think he went to such lengths to ensure you would go with Lily as her bridal maid? Did you think it was a simple plan to kill two birds with one stone? Anna, do you remember those thugs who harassed you outside school in middle school? Of course, I remembered. Dennis had fought them off, leaving himself bruised and bloodied. But do you know what happened to them afterward? I had no idea. I only remembered that no boy had ever dared approach me after that. Dennis took care of them, ensuring they were sent to prison. For years, any man who dared have designs on you met with a miserable end. Anna, as a man, I know what it means when a man has such intense possessiveness toward a woman. Moreover, haven't you considered this? You ran away. And he'd rather see his carefully laid plans crumble than go through with the wedding. Anna, pushing me to the brink, has always been Dennis's greatest goal. My throat felt clogged, and tears began to spill over uncontrollably. But now, I want to know what matters more to him, you, or his future. I watched as Marco turned and walked out. My heart thundered erratically, and I couldn't describe what I felt. I hoped Dennis would come. Yet I dreaded it. He was born with a silver spoon, a man of noble destiny. Dennis shouldn't walk into danger. After all, he had a bright future ahead, a smooth path laid out for him. I didn't want anything to happen to him. But as a woman, as a mother, another part of me yearned for him to come. To know if I was really as important to Dennis as Marco claimed. I didn't know how much time had passed. My arms were beginning to go numb. The door creaked open once more. Straining, I lifted my head and saw that familiar figure behind Marco. But he no longer looked tall, confident, or proud. He was gaunt, his steps slow and awkward. This was no longer the Dennis I remembered, no trace of his former vitality and charm. Tears streamed down my face, and I couldn't stop myself from crying out, "Dennis, don't come any closer." He stopped in his tracks, lifting his gaze to look at me. Marco, however, strode over to me, holding a sharp, gleaming knife. The blade's edge hovered close to my cheek. "Don't worry, Anna, I won't actually hurt you." Marco's voice was soft, audible only to me. But I saw Dennis's expression change abruptly. "Marco." "Dennis," Marco sneered, "Anna is so beautiful. If I were to leave a mark on her face, wouldn't that be a terrible waste? Don't touch her." Dennis's voice was hoarse, his steps unsteady. "Marco, don't hurt her. She's terrified of pain. Whatever you want to do, do it to me." "To you? Are you serious?" "I'm serious. If you need to cut someone, cut my face. I'm a man, it doesn't matter if I'm scarred. But she's a woman, you can't mark her face." "Dennis." I stared at him, but my tears blurred his face beyond recognition. Dennis ignored me, his gaze fixed solely on Marco's hand. Marco lowered the knife from my face, letting it hover over my hand instead. "All right, no face, but how about her hand?" "Marco." Dennis clenched his fists, his eyes bloodshot. "I told you, whatever you want, take it out on me. Leave her alone." "So, you'll do anything I ask?" "Yes, as long as you don't hurt her." "How noble." Marco put the knife away. "Then why don't you let her down?" Dennis pleaded, looking at me. My hands were bound, numb and lifeless from lack of circulation. "If you keep her tied up like this, she'll be in pain." "Fine. Kneel and beg, Dennis, and I'll promise not to hurt her." I froze, stunned. Dennis was a man of immense pride. Would he kneel? Dennis looked at me one last time, and I thought I saw the faintest smile in his eyes. "Dennis." He turned back to Marco, his face calm and resolute. "Let Anna down. And I'll kneel right here." Marco raised his hand. "Hold on." Someone brought over several porcelain vases and smashed them on the ground. "Kneel on this." Dennis looked down at the shards without so much as a flicker of hesitation, then lowered himself onto them. "Dennis." I couldn't help it, I cried out, my voice breaking. Even Marco seemed taken aback. After a pause, he waved his hand, and his men untied the ropes around me, letting me down. "Dennis." I stumbled forward, wanting to run to him, but Marco grabbed my arm, holding me back. "What else do you want? Haven't you humiliated him enough, Marco?" "Of course it's not enough. Compared to the humiliation I've endured for years, this is nothing." Marco shoved me aside, his men restraining me, preventing any movement. "You said you'd do anything for her, didn't you?" Marco grabbed Dennis by the collar. "Then give up your position as the heir of the Morgan family. Leave the Morgans, and I'll let you and Anna go." Dennis let out a soft laugh. "Fine, I'll give up my place as the Morgan family's heir if you think you can hold on to it." "If you could hold on to it, Marco can too." "All right, then it's yours." Dennis's father had fallen gravely ill. The double blow of a broken engagement and his son's entanglement with a servant's daughter, leaving him bedridden in the ICU. With both Dennis and his father incapacitated, Marco could act with impunity. And there was nothing I could do. I watched helplessly as Marco took 2 family seals from Dennis. Dennis's face remained calm, as if he'd handed over something trivial. But I knew those were 2 of the most important seals of the Morgan family. Only 2 others remained, held by their father. Marco and his men finally left. Before departing, Marco even thanked me. "Anna, I owe you thanks. If you hadn't run away, I wouldn't have had today's success." I refused to look at that despicable man, instead stumbling over to Dennis, trying to help him up. But his pant legs were soaked in blood, and when I touched his arm, he shuddered. Only then did I realize his back and arms were bleeding as well. "Dennis." I didn't dare touch him any further, my tears falling uncontrollably as I could only helplessly call his name. "Always crying, you've been a crybaby ever since we were kids." Dennis's face was pale from blood loss. He raised a hand to wipe my tears, but his fingers were cold as ice. I stopped crying, clutching his arm tightly, trying to pull him up. But the moment he stood, he wavered and collapsed back down heavily. "Dennis, darling, don't scare me. I'll take you to the hospital right now." "Anna." He closed his eyes, struggling to lift his hand to hold mine. I quickly placed my hand in his. He grasped it, but his grip was weak. "Anna. I'm here. What do you want to say?" "I'm sorry, Anna." With what seemed like his last ounce of strength, he looked at me gently. "Don't cry. I probably won't be able to comfort you anymore." As my sobs filled the room, Dennis slipped into unconsciousness. While Dennis was recovering, he became unusually clingy. If he woke up and didn't see me, he'd get upset. He wasn't the esteemed young master of the Morgan family anymore, and likely didn't have much money left. Now, he could only stay in the little cottage at my place, with only Ian, his loyal assistant, by his side. I didn't mind taking care of my man, especially since he was the father of my child. But since he was still injured, I hadn't yet told him about the pregnancy, worried his excitement might reopen his wounds. I brought a plate of freshly made mashed potatoes into the room, and the moment Dennis saw me, he calmed down. Ian, visibly relieved, quickly stepped out, closing the door behind him. "Here. Have something to eat." I handed the plate of mashed potatoes to him, but he refused to take it. "I want you to feed me." "All right, I'll feed you." Smiling, I spooned the mashed potatoes and fed him bite by bite. After he finished, I was about to go wash the dishes, but he wouldn't let me. "Have Ian do it, you stay with me. Ian isn't your nanny. It's not right to make him do everything." "Anna." All right. I'll stay with you." I was afraid of upsetting him, so I coaxed him gently. This man, since his injury, he'd turned into a child. He pulled back the blanket, asking me to lie beside him. In the warm afternoon light filling the small room, I nestled in his arms, and we chatted softly. "Anna, what if I can't support you anymore? I don't eat much, I'm easy to take care of. I might not even have a home. Then you can live in my home. This little cottage is enough for us. Life will be hard if you stay with me. If you, a young master, can endure hardship, then so can I." I lay in his arms, looking up at him. "Dear, we can both take care of ourselves. Things will only get better." "You're right. I'll work hard to support my wife and child." Dennis brushed my hair back, cupping my face as he kissed me gently. "Will you run away again?" I won't. I pouted and mumbled. "But you bullied me, wanted me to be Lily's maid." At the time, I knew there was a spy around me, but I couldn't immediately identify them, so I said those things on purpose. "Why didn't you tell me earlier? If I'd told you, I worried you, my little fool, might give something away, and Marco would use you to threaten me." Dennis sighed. Who would have thought, after all that, it would still come to this? It seems you always find ways to make things difficult for me. So, do you regret being with me? I asked, casting him a sidelong glance. Yes, I regret it. Dennis gazed down at me. If I'd known it would end up like this, I would have married you from the start, no matter what. Then you wouldn't have run off for so long. Do you know what I thought that morning when I woke up and found you gone? What were you thinking? That I'd better not find you. Because if I did, I'd tie you to the bed and have you give me a child every year, so you'd never escape. So, you only want me to give you children? I pretended to be angry and glared at him. Or maybe I just want to use our children to keep you from ever leaving me again. Do you really not want me to leave that much? My heart was full of warmth, but there was a surreal feeling. As if I were in a dream. Yes. After you left, I realized something. What's that? That I might care about you even more than I thought. Dennis's eyes darkened. But Anna. What is it? I asked softly, noticing he looked suddenly upset. Are you feeling unwell? I never once thought of leaving you, but you could bear to just leave me behind. Dennis, don't be angry. I won't do that ever again. But he seemed genuinely annoyed. Closing his eyes and turning away from me, ignoring my attempts to soothe him. Anna, how many times have I taught you how to properly make up with someone, and you still don't remember? He leaned back against the bed, his shirt slightly open, revealing a strong chest. Though he'd lost weight and had a bit of stubble, he was still incredibly handsome. My face flushed slightly. But you're still recovering. His gaze grew darker. And he started to close his eyes again. I had no choice but to come clean. Dennis. It's not that I don't want to make it up to you, but someone else won't let me. Who? Who would dare? I bit my lip and took his hand, gently placing it over my belly. Your daughter. Dennis. He froze, staring at me, utterly still. Dennis. Anna. Dennis suddenly sat up and pulled me into a tight embrace. Be careful of your injuries. I gasped, quickly reminding him to be mindful of his wounds. But Dennis wouldn't let go, pressing his face into my shoulder, his voice trembling. Anna, don't lie to me. I'm not lying. We're having a baby, and she's a little girl. Anna. Yes? How do you know it's a girl? Grandmother told me. She said, with the way my body's been reacting, it's probably a little girl. I love daughters. She'll be as beautiful and adorable as you. I love daughters. Too. I'll love both you and our daughter. I know, so you need to recover soon and work hard. My savings aren't much. I will. Dennis stroked my hair and kissed me gently. I won't let you or our daughter suffer. After I gave birth to our daughter, Rose, Dennis brought us back to the Morgan family. A month ago, Marco had been arrested for multiple charges, including kidnapping, extortion, and blackmail. It was then I learned that Dennis's father's serious illness had been a ruse, an idea. Dennis proposed to reveal Marco's true colors. At the time, his father had been skeptical. After all, Marco was his biological son. But when Marco obtained Dennis's seal, he went straight to the hospital. Thinking that the old man was gravely ill and that Dennis had been expelled from the family. Believing that Lily and the Miller family now loathed Dennis, Marco easily aligned them to his side, thinking he had everything under control. With nothing holding him back, he dropped his act as the dutiful son, showing his true face at his father's bedside. Deeply hurt, the old man had no choice but to accept the truth, ultimately deciding to sever ties with his son. After nearly a year, returning to this familiar place felt like stepping into another life. As I got out of the car holding Rose, Dennis offered me his arm. Are you tired? Want me to hold her for a while? No, I'm fine. I smiled at him. She's asleep, let's not wake her. Dennis looked at me, then down at our precious daughter in her swaddle. His expression filled with tenderness. His father was still resting upstairs, but his mother gave Rose and me a warm welcome gift. She doted on Rose, holding her and reluctant to let go. I felt nervous, even though his mother had always been kind to me. But I knew well enough that in a family like this, it was unlikely they'd completely overlook an in-law's background. Rose started to fuss softly. Likely hungry. I quickly stood up to take her. "Madam, let me hold her so I can feed her." She handed Rose to me but smiled warmly, saying, "Rose is a month old now. It's time we start planning your wedding with Dennis." "Madam, isn't it about time you started calling me Mom?" Staring at her kind face, a swell of emotions overcame me. And all I could do was let silent tears fall. I've reached an age where I've learned to let go of many things. As long as you and Dennis are happy together, that's all that matters. With Marco out of the picture, a huge weight had lifted from her, and she looked healthier and more at peace. "Mom," I whispered, and my heart flooded with emotions I couldn't contain. She smiled, acknowledging my words. Dennis gently put his arm around me, wiping away my endless tears. When Rose turned 100 days old, Dennis and I finally held our wedding. The night before the wedding, we stayed in my little room. The moonlight was beautiful that night, too. Since the bed was small, he had to hold me tightly. Pressed together like this, we could stay close without fear of me falling off. Dennis held my hand tightly, our fingers intertwined. We didn't do anything, we just lay there, holding each other in silence. At 6, I'd been his little wife in our pretend games. By 16, I only dared to dream of moments like this. There's nothing more beautiful than a childhood dream coming true. The first person I ever loved would be the one I'd spend my life with. "Anna," Dennis murmured, nibbling playfully at my ear. "Now that we have a daughter, you still have to love me the most." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're such a big child. What do you know?" He gave me a mock glare and leaned in for a kiss. When a man truly loves a woman, he'll act like a child in front of her. And Dennis planned to stay a child for Anna, for the rest of his life.